That cold morning, no one expected an act of kindness to change everything. What started as another day became a story the whole community tried to explain, and few had the courage to tell. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here we show that behind struggle and silence, there are still human hearts. The air hung heavy with the chill of early dawn, a biting fog rolling in from the distant river that carried the faint, acrid scent of exhaust and damp earth. Highway 17 stretched like a grey vein through the outskirts of the city, its asphalt cracked and littered with the debris of hurried lives, discarded cups, faded flyers fluttering in the wind. Headlights from the occasional truck pierced the mist, casting long shadows that danced across the shoulder where wild grasses bent under the weight of dew. It was the kind of place where the world moved too fast to notice the forgotten, where the hum of tires on concrete drowned out quieter pleas. Ilara had been walking that stretch for what felt like hours, her threadbare sneakers crunching softly against the gravel. At 17, she was a shadow among shadows, her dark hair matted and tangled, falling over eyes that had long ago learned to avoid contact. The backpack slung over one shoulder held all she owned, a worn blanket, a half-empty water bottle, and a small notebook filled with sketches of places she'd never been. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. A familiar ache she'd pushed down since running from the foster home 2 years prior, the one with the locked doors and the bruises that no one believed were accidents. She didn't beg anymore. The rejections had carved a quiet resolve into her, a determination to fade into the background, to survive without drawing eyes that judged or hands that hurt. Society saw her as just another street kid, a problem to be swept away, invisible until she became a nuisance. But Ilara watched. She noticed the rhythms of the road, the truckers who tossed half-eaten sandwiches from their cabs, the families in minivans who averted their gazes as if her presence might taint their hurried escapes. The fog thickened as the sun struggled to rise, painting the sky in muted greys and oranges. Ilara paused near a cluster of overgrown bushes by the guardrail, her breath visible in shallow puffs. The cold seeped through her thin jacket, making her fingers tremble as she rummaged for her last granola bar. That's when she heard it, a faint, wavering cry, like the mewl of a distant cat, swallowed quickly by the whoosh of passing cars. She froze, heart quickening in her chest, the sound pulling at something deep within her, a memory she kept buried, the wail of her own infant cries, echoing in a room she'd been too young to remember before the system claimed her. Shaking her head, she dismissed it as the wind, but the cry came again, sharper this time, insistent. Kneeling in the damp grass, Ilara pushed aside the branches, her hands sinking into the mud. There, nestled in a shallow depression lined with crumpled fast food wrappers, was a bundle no larger than a loaf of bread. A newborn, swaddled in a blood-stained towel, its tiny face flushed and wrinkled, eyes squeezed shut against the world. The baby's cries were weak, ragged, its skin pale from the chill, little fists flailing in futile protest. Ilara's breath caught, a wave of nausea rising as she realized the truth. This child had been abandoned here, left to the mercy of the highway's indifferent rush. No note, no sign of the mother, just the stark vulnerability of new life discarded like trash. Panic flickered in her chest, but she moved with a steady calm born of necessity. Gently, she scooped the infant into her arms, the warmth of its small body a stark contrast to the cold air. The baby quieted slightly at her touch, nestling against her chest as if sensing safety. Ilara's mind raced. The police station was miles away, and who would believe a homeless girl with no ID? Flashes of her own past assaulted her, the social workers who had labeled her trouble, the nights she'd hidden from patrols, always running from the fear of being seen as worthless. But this baby, it couldn't run. It needed someone, anyone, to bridge the silence that had nearly claimed it. Wrapping her jacket around them both, she stood, cradling the child close, her heartbeat sinking with its faint pulses. The highway loomed, cars blurring past, oblivious. As she began to walk toward the city lights flickering on the horizon, the weight of the moment settled over her like the fog. Ilara had always tried to stay unseen, to let the world pass without her interference. But here, in the quiet before the dawn fully broke, she couldn't ignore the tiny life trusting her against all odds. The cries had pierced her armor, reminding her of the guilt she carried, the belief that she hadn't been worth saving, yet now she was the one holding salvation in her arms. The first rays of sun broke through, warming her back, but the road ahead felt longer, fraught with the judgments she knew awaited. Little did she know, this act would unravel threads connecting her to a world of quiet guardians, hidden behind starched uniforms and beeping monitors, who understood loss in ways the outside world could never comprehend. In the hospital across town, under the relentless glow of fluorescent lights that buzzed like distant insects, the night shift dragged on. The antiseptic tang clung to everything, mingling with the faint metallic hint of blood from the ER bays. Nurses moved like ghosts through the corridors, their footsteps muffled on linoleum floors worn smooth by countless emergencies. Dr. Elena Vasquez glanced at the clock, 5:47 a.m., her hand steady as she charted vitals for a patient in room 204. The ward was a sanctuary of controlled chaos, where beeps from monitors marked the fragile line between life and despair. But whispers had already begun circulating among the staff. A missing newborn from the maternity wing reported gone just after midnight. The mother, overwhelmed and alone, had vanished too, leaving only questions and a growing knot of worry. Nurse Lila Torres, with her 20 years of shifts etched into the lines around her eyes, paused at the nurse's station, her coffee growing cold in its styrofoam cup. The hospital was more than a workplace. It was a family forged in the fires of long nights and lost causes. Outsiders saw them as cold professionals, detached in their scrubs. But Lila knew the truth. The way a trembling hand on a patient's forehead betrayed the compassion they armored with efficiency. As the fog outside the windows began to lift, she felt an inexplicable pull, a mother's intuition for the unseen. The search teams were mobilizing, but in the quiet before the storm, no one could have predicted the unlikely bridge that would span the divide between the streets and these sterile halls. Ilara's steps echoed faintly against the cracked sidewalk as the city began to stir, the distant rumble of buses joining the symphony of awakening streets. The baby stirred in her arms, its soft whimpers muffled against the folds of her jacket, each sound a fragile thread pulling at the edges of her resolve. The morning light filtered through the haze, casting elongated shadows from the skeletal frames of abandoned billboards that advertised lives far removed from hers. Smiling families in sunlit homes, promises of security she had long ceased to dream of. Her legs ached from the miles she'd already covered, the gravel from the highway still clinging to her shoes like unwelcome memories. The air grew warmer as she neared the urban sprawl, carrying the mingled scents of fresh-baked bread from a corner bakery and the sharper tang of garbage bins overflowing in the alleys. But beneath it all lingered the faint, milky warmth of the infant's breath, a reminder that time was slipping away. She had chosen the hospital instinctively, the one she'd passed countless times while scavenging for discarded meals behind its cafeteria. St. Mary's General loomed ahead, its brick facade rising like a monolith against the paling sky, windows glowing with the unyielding fluorescence that never slept. Ilara hesitated at the emergency entrance, the automatic doors hissing open and shut with mechanical indifference, admitting harried figures in coats and scrubs. Her heart pounded, a steady drumbeat in her ears, as she imagined the reception, the skeptical glances, the questions she couldn't answer without unraveling her fragile anonymity. Who was she to bring this child here? A runaway with no papers, no story that wouldn't paint her as the villain. The guilt twisted deeper, the foster system's echoes whispering that she was tainted, unworthy of trust. Yet the baby's tiny fingers curled against her skin, and she stepped forward, crossing the threshold into a world of polished floors and echoing voices. Inside, the ER buzzed with subdued urgency, the air thick with the sterile bite of disinfectant that stung her nostrils and made her eyes water. Monitors beeped in rhythmic cadence from curtained bays, their green lights flickering like distant stars in the controlled dimness. Nurses in crisp blue uniforms moved with purposeful grace, clipboards in hand, their faces etched with the quiet exhaustion of those who bore witness to humanity's rawest edges. Ilara approached the triage desk, her arms cradling the bundle tighter, the chill from outside still clinging to her clothes. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose, looked up from her computer screen, her expression shifting from routine boredom to sharp concern as her gaze landed on the infant. "What happened?" the woman asked, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of alarm, rising slightly to summon help. Ilara's throat tightened, words faltering as she tried to explain the highway, the bushes, the cries that had drawn her in. But her voice emerged small, hesitant, tangled with the fear of disbelief. The receptionist nodded briskly, already pressing a button under the desk, and within moments a nurse appeared, her sneakers squeaking softly on the tile. Nurse Lila Torres, though Ilara didn't know her name yet, extended gloved hands with a gentleness that belied the urgency in her eyes. As she took the baby, unwrapping the towel to assess the tiny form, a gasp escaped her lips. The infant's skin was mottled with cold, its cries now a feeble mewl that pierced the air like a plea. "It's the missing one," Lila murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, recognition dawning as she glanced at the blood-stained fabric. The ER seemed to pause, heads turning, a ripple of hushed conversation spreading like fog through the ward. Ilara stood frozen, the sudden emptiness in her arms amplifying the tremor in her hands. She had expected gratitude, perhaps, or at least indifference. But instead, suspicion flickered in the eyes of a security guard who approached, his radio crackling with static. "How did you find it? Where's the mother?" His tone was clipped, probing, the weight of assumptions settling over her like a shroud. To them, she was an intruder, a street-worn girl who might have been involved, her disheveled appearance a canvas for their doubts. Ilara's chest tightened with the familiar sting of judgment. The same looks she'd endured from passers-by, the ones that branded her as trouble before she could speak. She backed away instinctively, her mind racing toward the exit, the guilt surging anew. She had saved the child, but at what cost to herself? In the maternity wing upstairs, the news spread like a quiet current through the veins of the hospital. Dr. Elena Vasquez paused mid-stride in the hallway, her stethoscope dangling like a pendant of duty around her neck. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pallid glow on the white walls lined with faded posters, urging hand-washing and hope. The staff had been on edge since the disappearance, the mother's frantic report hours earlier igniting a search that had stretched resources thin. To the outside world, hospitals like St. Mary's were fortresses of efficiency, places where lives were tallied in charts and outcomes measured in statistics. Cold, they called it, impersonal machines grinding through crises without soul. But Elena knew the truth, felt it in the way Lila's hands shook ever so slightly as she cradled the newborn, tears welling unbidden in her eyes. These nurses, these doctors, carried the weight of every loss in the subtle sag of their shoulders, the way they lingered a moment longer at a bedside, offering silent solidarity to the broken. Lila rocked the baby gently as she hurried to the neonatal unit, the soft beeps of incubators welcoming them like a chorus of fragile heartbeats. The warmth of the room enveloped them, a stark contrast to the chill Ilara had brought in from the streets. "You're safe now, little one," Lila whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The words a balm for her own hidden scars. The stillborn she had delivered years ago, the grief that lingered in quiet moments like this. The staff gathered subtly, not in chaos, but in a coordinated hush, drawing blood, starting IVs, their movements a dance honed by countless nights. Yet beneath the protocol lay a deeper misunderstanding. Society saw them as detached guardians, armored in science. But they were the unseen mourners, the ones who wept in supply closets for the patients who slipped away. The missing newborn's return stirred something profound, a reminder of the vulnerabilities they patched together daily, often at the cost of their own rest, their own hearts. Down in the ER, Ilara sat on a hard plastic chair, the security guard's questions pressing like fingers on a bruise. Her fingers twisted the hem of her jacket, the absence of the baby's warmth leaving her hollow. She had run from homes that judged her, from systems that overlooked her pain. But here, in this place of healing, the isolation felt sharper. The nurses passing by offered fleeting glances, curiosity mixed with caution, but none approached. Their focus pulled back to the tiny life now fighting under their care. The air conditioner hummed softly, circulating the antiseptic chill, and Ilara's breath came in shallow waves, the moral ache blooming. She had acted on instinct, driven by the echo of her own abandonment, but now the world demanded proof of her goodness. Outside, the city traffic swelled, oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding within these walls, where compassion hid behind clipboards and closed doors. As the first tears traced paths down Lila's cheeks in the neonatal room, she glanced toward the ER, a pull forming in her chest. The girl downstairs, the one who had bridged the impossible gap, reminded her of so many others, lost souls the world dismissed. The hospital's hierarchy, from head nurse to weary intern, operated on trust earned in the trenches, but outsiders rarely saw the humanity that bound them. In that moment, as the baby's cries steadied into softer breaths, the seeds of connection took root, unseen but inevitable, drawing the overlooked toward the light they so desperately guarded. The fluorescent lights above the ER waiting area flickered intermittently, casting erratic shadows across the scuffed linoleum floor that stretched like an endless corridor of muted blues and greys. Ilara sat hunched on the edge of the plastic chair, her fingers interlaced tightly in her lap, knuckles whitening as if to anchor herself against the tide of uncertainty swelling within. The air conditioner droned on, a low mechanical hum that blended with the distant murmur of voices from behind the triage desk. Clipped exchanges about dosages and shift changes, words that formed a barrier she couldn't breach. The antiseptic scent had seeped into her clothes, mingling with the faint, earthy residue of the highway mud still caked on her sneakers, a reminder of the world she'd left behind just moments ago. Her heart beat in uneven rhythms, each thud echoing the fear that had chased her for years, the terror of being seen, truly seen, and found wanting. The security guard loomed nearby, his broad frame blocking the path to the exit, notepad in hand as he jotted down her sparse answers. "You say you found the baby by the highway. No one else around, no car, no bag?" His voice was measured, professional, but laced with the subtle edge of doubt that Ilara knew all too well, the kind that came from years of dealing with stories that unraveled under scrutiny. She nodded faintly, her gaze fixed on the floor, where a stray droplet of water from her jacket pooled and spread. Explaining felt like peeling back layers of scar tissue, the foster homes with their echoing accusations, the nights she'd curled in doorways, wondering if she deserved the scraps of kindness life tossed her way. "I heard it crying," she whispered, her voice barely rising above the beeps of a nearby monitor. That's all. I couldn't just leave it." But even as she spoke, the weight of implication hung heavy. Was she a savior or a suspect? The guard's radio crackled again, summoning him briefly away, leaving her alone with the silence that pressed in like a vice. Upstairs in the neonatal intensive care unit, the atmosphere shifted from urgency to a fragile calm. The room bathed in the soft, diffused glow of warming lamps that hummed gently overhead. Nurse Lila Torres stood by the incubator, her gloved hands hovering near the tiny form now swaddled in crisp white linens, lines snaking delicately to deliver warmth and nourishment. The baby's chest rose and fell in shallow, steadying breaths, the monitor's green waveform tracing a tentative promise of stability. Tears had dried on Lila's cheeks, leaving faint, salty tracks that she wiped away with the back of her wrist, careful not to disturb the sterile field. The room smelled of warmed formula and the faint, clean ozone from the equipment, a sanctuary amid the hospital's ceaseless pulse. Dr. Elena Vasquez entered quietly, her white coat whispering against the doorframe, eyes scanning the vitals with the practiced precision of someone who had coaxed life from the brink too many times. "It's her, the missing one from Ward 3, Eleanor confirmed softly, her voice a low anchor in the quiet. The staff had gathered in a loose semicircle, not crowding but present, their faces reflecting the layered emotions of relief and unspoken sorrow. Head nurse Miriam Hale, with her silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun, nodded from the doorway, her arms crossed not in defense, but in the subtle brace against vulnerability. To the world outside these walls, they were the unflinching backbone of medicine, efficient, emotionless cogs in a vast machine. But here, in the hush, broken only by the incubator's rhythmic sigh, the truth surfaced. These women and men carried ghosts of their own, losses etched into the quiet pauses between shifts. Lila's mind drifted to her daughter, lost to a complication years ago, the echo of tiny cries that never fully faded. The newborn's arrival, delivered by an unlikely stranger, stirred that ache, transforming it into a fierce, protective resolve. Down in the ER, the emotional turn came unbidden, a crack in the facade of routine that rippled through the ward. Ilara's eyes lifted as a young nurse, her scrubs slightly rumpled from the night's demands, approached with a styrofoam cup of water. "Here," the nurse said gently, extending it without fanfare, her expression softening the edges of the clinical space. But before Ilara could respond, a commotion stirred from the maternity wing, footsteps echoing down the stairwell, voices rising in a blend of sobs and urgent whispers. The mother had been found, wandering disoriented blocks away, her nightgown torn and muddied, his hollow with the terror of her unraveling mind. She was a single parent, overwhelmed by poverty and isolation, the abandonment a desperate act born of despair rather than malice. As they wheeled her in on a gurney, her frail form trembling under the thin blanket, the ER doors swung open wider, admitting a wave of empathy that clashed with the earlier suspicion. Ilara watched from her chair, the scene unfolding like a slow-motion revelation. The mother's cries, raw, guttural, mirrored the baby's earlier mewls, piercing the air and tugging at the buried wounds in Ilara's chest. She remembered her own fragmented memories, being handed off like a parcel, the cold indifference of hands that should have held. Everyone in the ER seemed to freeze, the receptionist pausing mid-keystroke. The security guard lowering his notepad, doctors glancing up from their charts. The air thickened with the scent of fresh saline and the faint, metallic tang of IV stands being adjusted. But Ilara couldn't stay seated. Her body moved before her mind could protest, drawn inexorably toward the gurney where the woman lay, her face contorted in grief. "It's okay," Ilara murmured, stepping closer despite the instinctive recoil of the staff, her voice a tentative bridge across the chasm of misunderstanding. The mother's eyes met hers, wild with confusion, and in that gaze Ilara saw her own reflection, not as a threat, but as a mirror to shared abandonment. The rising tension built in the heartbeat of that connection, the mother's hand reaching out weakly, fingers brushing Ilara's sleeve. Questions swirled unspoken. How had this girl, overlooked and judged, become the thread binding their fractures? Lila, summoned from upstairs, arrived just then, her face streaked anew with tears as she knelt by the gurney, whispering reassurances. The hospital's hierarchy mobilized subtly, Miriam directing traffic with quiet authority, Elena consulting charts with steady hands, but beneath it all lay the moral conflict. Protocols demanded verification, yet compassion urged trust. Ilara's presence, once suspect, now evoked a deeper truth. She embodied the vulnerabilities they fought to protect daily. The lost children who slipped through cracks wider than any system could mend. The guard stepped back, his posture easing. As the first waves of understanding washed over the room, outside, the morning sun climbed higher, its light filtering through the blinds in golden slivers, illuminating the quiet heroism unfolding in the shadows of judgment. In that suspended moment, as the mother's sobs softened into exhausted sighs, Ilara felt the adrenaline ebb, replaced by a trembling determination. She had run from her past. But here, amid the beeps and whispers, it caught up, not to condemn, but to redeem. The nurse's tears, flowing freely now, spoke of a community forged in silence, one that recognized its own in the unlikeliest forms. The tension coiled tighter, the weight of revelations yet to come pressing like the humid air before a storm, but for the first time, Ilara didn't feel alone in the downpour. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of courage and loyalty can travel. The corridor outside the ER stretched like a vein under the hospital's skin, its walls lined with carts of linens and the faint, persistent hum of overhead vents circulating air that never quite warmed the chill of uncertainty. Ilara stood rooted near the gurney, her hand still lightly touching the mother's arm, the fabric of the thin blanket rough against her fingertips. The woman's eyes, red-rimmed and glassy, held a fractured plea that mirrored the fragments of Ilara's own shattered trust. Abandonments stacked like invisible bricks, building walls no one bothered to scale. The mother's breaths came in ragged hitches, each one carrying the weight of a night unraveling into madness, her fingers clutching at Ilara's sleeve as if anchoring to the only steady presence in the storm. Around them, the staff moved in a careful orbit, their footsteps soft on the linoleum, voices lowered to murmurs that blended with the steady beep of monitors, tracking pulses too erratic to ignore. Dr. Elena Vasquez knelt beside the gurney, her stethoscope cool against the woman's chest, listening to the frantic rhythm beneath. "We need to get her stable," Elena said quietly, her tone a blend of command and care, signaling to a nearby tech for a sedative. But as the needle pierced skin, the mother's grip tightened on Ilara, a whisper escaping her lips. "My baby. Is she?" The question hung unfinished, laced with the terror of finality, and Ilara nodded, her throat constricting around the words she forced out. "She's here, upstairs. They're taking care of her." The admission stirred something visceral in the room, a collective exhale that rippled through the nurses like a shared breath held too long. Lila Torres, standing just behind, wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, the gesture small but laden with the exhaustion of nights when such reunions ended in silence. Yet the tension coiled tighter, an undercurrent of confrontation brewing in the shadows of protocol. Head nurse Miriam Hale approached from the hallway, her clipboard a shield of authority, eyes narrowing as they settled on Ilara. "You, step back. We need your full statement now." Her voice was firm, edged with the moral bind that defined their world: trust the system or risk the chaos it was built to contain. Miriam had seen too many cases where good intentions blurred into liability, the runaways who vanished with evidence, the desperate who turned vengeful under scrutiny. To her, Ilara was an unknown variable, a girl whose disheveled clothes and haunted gaze evoked the very vulnerabilities the hospital patched but couldn't always save. The security guard, lingering at the periphery, straightened, his hand resting near his belt, the radio on his shoulder crackling with a dispatcher's query about the ongoing investigation. "Social services is en route," he added, his words landing like a gavel, implying containment more than compassion. Ilara's pulse quickened, adrenaline surging through her veins like ice water, sharpening the edges of every sound, the squeak of wheels on the gurney being adjusted, the soft rustle of IV tubing, the distant wail of an elevator arriving. Fear clawed at her chest, the old instinct to flee warring with the determination that had carried her this far. She had run from foster homes, where questions like these led to locked rooms and accusations, where her word was dismissed as the ramblings of a troubled teen. Guilt twisted deeper now, not just for her past, but for this moment. By stepping forward, she had invited the judgment she feared most, potentially unraveling the fragile safety she'd glimpsed in the baby's trusting weight. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, meeting Miriam's gaze for the first time. The head nurse paused, something flickering in her expression, a crack in the armor of routine, born from years of witnessing the overlooked become the overlooked's undoing. As the mother was wheeled toward a private bay, her sobs fading into the sedative's embrace, the group converged subtly, forming a human corridor that guided the procession with quiet efficiency. Lila fell into step beside Ilara, her presence a gentle buffer against the encroaching scrutiny. "Come with me," she urged softly, her arm brushing Ilara's in a gesture that spoke of solidarity forged in the quiet hours. They moved toward a side room off the ER, the door clicking shut behind them, sealing out the main ward's bustle. Inside, the space was sparse, a single exam bed, a sink with dripping faucet echoing like a metronome, fluorescent light buzzing overhead in relentless persistence. The air carried the faint, lingering scent of coffee from a forgotten mug on the counter, mingling with the ever-present antiseptic that coated everything like a second skin. Seated on the bed's edge, Ilara's legs dangled, her sneakers leaving faint mud prints on the floor. Lila pulled up a stool, her scrubs whispering as she sat, eyes searching Ilara's face with the intensity of someone piecing together a puzzle long unsolved. "That baby. You saved her life. But how? Why you?" The question wasn't accusatory but probing, laced with the curiosity of a woman who had bandaged wounds that told stories of streets and silences. Ilara hesitated, the words tumbling out in fragments. The fog on the highway, the cry that pierced her numbness, the echo of her own infancy lost to the system's indifferent hands. As she spoke, tears welled unbidden, hot trails down her cheeks, the vulnerability stripping away the layers she'd built to survive. Lila listened, her own breath catching, hands clasping in her lap as memories surfaced. Her niece, a runaway teen much like Ilara, who had disappeared into the city's underbelly years ago, leaving only unanswered calls and a grief that nights like this resurrected. The revelation unfolded slowly, a deeper truth emerging in the room's hushed confines. "You remind me of her," Lila confessed, her voice breaking on the edge of whisper, eyes glistening under the harsh light. "My sister's girl, same eyes, same quiet strength. She was homeless too, running from everything. We searched, but the world swallowed her whole." The admission hung between them, redefining the suspicion into recognition. Ilara wasn't just a stranger, but an echo of their collective losses. The runaways who haunted supply closets and break rooms, symbols of the failures the staff fought against in every shift. Miriam, entering quietly with a file, overheard the tail end, her posture softening as she set the clipboard aside. The baby upstairs, now stable and symbolic of fragile new beginnings, mirrored the second chances they all craved, the ones denied to so many, like Ilara's mirrored ghost. Outside the room, the hospital stirred with the escalation of Dawn's demands. Pages over the intercom summoning teams, the clatter of breakfast trays being prepared. But within, the moral danger peaked in the confrontation of truths, Ilara's determination holding firm against the guilt that whispered retreat, the nurse's compassion cracking open to reveal the humanity society misjudged as cold detachment. Elena joined them, her presence steadying the air, and in that circle the tension began to yield, threads of belonging weaving through the fear. Ilara's hands, no longer trembling alone, found solace in the shared silence, the first hints of protection emerging from the unlikeliest guardians. The newborn's cries, faint from monitors down the hall, pulsed like a heartbeat binding them, promising redemption amid the beeps and shadows. The door to the side room clicked shut with a finality that echoed in Ilara's ears, sealing the three women in a cocoon of muted light and lingering confessions. The fluorescent bulb overhead hummed persistently, casting a sterile pallor over the exam bed where Ilara perched, her body rigid, as if braced for the next inevitable blow. The air in the small space felt thicker now, heavy with the residue of shared grief, the faint, briny trace of tears mingling with the ever-present antiseptic that coated her tongue like a bitter film. Lila's revelation hung between them, a fragile bridge spanning the chasm of their separate silences, her eyes still glistening as she leaned forward on the stool, hands clasped tightly to steady their subtle tremble. Miriam stood by the sink, arms crossed over her clipboard like a barrier, but the lines around her mouth had softened, the stern facade cracking under the weight of recognition. Dr. Elena Vasquez remained near the door, her white coat a quiet sentinel, fingers absently tracing the edge of her stethoscope as if grounding herself in the familiar ritual. Ilara's breath came shallow, each inhale pulling in the room's confined warmth, her mind reeling from Lila's words. The niece, lost to the streets, much like the shadows Ilara had navigated for years, stirred a moral storm within her. Guilt surged anew, not just for her own fractured past, but for the lives like that girl's, the ones she'd glimpsed in alleyway huddles and never dared approach, fearing her touch would only spread the curse of invisibility. "I didn't mean to bring all this," she murmured, her voice fracturing on the edges, gaze dropping to the muddied floor where her sneakers left indelible marks. The determination that had propelled her from the highway now warred with the urge to vanish, to slip out before the questions turned to chains. Outside, the hospital's pulse quickened, the distant roll of a cart, the soft chime of an elevator, voices overlapping in the corridor like whispers of impending judgment. Miriam uncrossed her arms, the clipboard slipping to her side with a faint rustle of paper. "No one chooses this path," she said, her tone measured, carrying the quiet authority honed from decades of mediating between protocol and pain. But beneath it lay her own conflict, the head nurse who enforced rules to protect the fragile ecosystem of care, yet remembered her first year on the job, when a young patient, much like Ilara, had been shuttled back to the streets, only to return months later in a body bag. Society painted them as gatekeepers, cold enforcers of bureaucracy, but Miriam knew the truth. Every decision etched deeper into their resolve, a toughness born of compassion too often repaid with blame. Social services will want a full report. They'll dig into your story, and if it's not clean. She trailed off, the implications settling like fog, her eyes meeting Ilara's with a flicker of empathy that belied the warning. The tension escalated as a knock sounded at the door, sharp and insistent, shattering the room's fragile equilibrium. Elena opened it to reveal the security guard, his frame filling the threshold, flanked by a woman in a crisp blazer, Ms. Harlan from Child Protective Services, her briefcase clutched like a shield, expression etched with the weary professionalism of one who navigated nightmares daily. "We need to speak with the girl alone," Harlan stated, her voice even but probing, eyes scanning Ilara with clinical detachment. The air shifted, charged with the scent of fresh ink from her notepad and the faint floral of her perfume, clashing against the room's sterility. Ilara's heart hammered, a frantic rhythm drowning out the vent's hum, adrenaline flooding her limbs as memories assaulted her. The Foster interviews where her truths were twisted into lies, the nights she'd hidden from caseworkers who saw potential threats in her silence. She rose instinctively, backing toward the wall, her hands clenching into fists to mask their shake. "Please," she whispered, not to them but to the ether, but to the plea laced with the desperation of someone who'd learned trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Lila stood abruptly, her stool scraping against the tile with a grating screech that cut through the standoff. "She's not a suspect. She's the one who brought the baby in, without her." Her voice broke, the compassion behind her toughness surfacing in the fierce set of her jaw, tears threatening anew as she positioned herself between Ilara and the newcomers. The group outside the neonatal unit had swelled subtly, nurses pausing mid-task, doctors glancing from doorways, their presence a quiet undercurrent of support, misunderstood by outsiders as mere curiosity, but rooted in the bonds forged through shared vigils. Elena stepped forward too, her hand resting lightly on Harlan's arm, a gesture of mediation that spoke volumes. "Give us a moment. This isn't just procedure. It's a life." The moral danger peaked here, in the confrontation of systems clashing against human instinct. Protocols demanding isolation while the staff's quiet heroism urged inclusion, their hierarchy bending not in rebellion, but in the subtle defiance of those who knew the cost of oversight. As Harlan hesitated, notepad poised, the late revelation deepened, unfolding like layers peeled from a long-buried wound. Miriam, surprising even herself, set her clipboard on the sink with a decisive clack. "Wait," she interjected, her voice steadying the room. "This girl, she reminds us all of someone." She glanced at Lila, then Elena, drawing them into the admission. Elena nodded, her composure fracturing slightly as she recalled her own sister, an abused youth who'd fled home and washed up in their ER years ago, only to slip away before help could anchor her. "We lost her to the streets, just like so many. But Ilara, she acted when no one else could. The baby upstairs, she's not just any child. She's a symbol of what we fight for every shift. The new lives we guard against the abandonments that echo our own failures." The words hung, redefining the moment. Ilara wasn't an anomaly, but a reflection of their collective scars, the runaways they'd failed to save, the vulnerabilities that haunted break room silences and night shift confessions. Harlan's expression softened imperceptibly, the notepad lowering as the truth permeated the tension, humanizing the girl before her into something more than a file. Ilara's breath hitched, the adrenaline ebbing into a trembling release, her body sagging against the wall as the weight of acceptance began to form. The staff encircled her now, not in formality, but in a loose, protective ring, their hands brushing her shoulders, offering silent reassurance amid the beeps filtering from the hall. Lila squeezed her arm gently, the touch warm against the chill of fear receding. "You're not alone anymore," she murmured, the promise carrying the depth of their misunderstood world, where compassion hid behind charts and scrubs, waiting for those brave enough to bridge the divide. Outside, the morning light strengthened, slanting through a high window in golden shafts that warmed the floor. illuminating the path toward belonging. The confrontation yielded, Harlan stepping back with a nod, agreeing to a joint interview, the escalation giving way to the first threads of redemption. In that room, amid the hum and whispers, Ilara felt the stirrings of community, a quiet heroism mirroring her own, binding the overlooked to guardians she'd never known she needed. The newborn's distant monitor beeped steadily, a heartbeat syncing with theirs, promising that even in the shadows of judgment, humanity endured. The soft glow of the afternoon sun filtered through the half-drawn blinds of the side room, casting elongated patterns across the linoleum floor like veins of light, piercing the veil of exhaustion. Ilara remained pressed against the wall, her body a taut string vibrating with the remnants of confrontation, the air still thick with the mingled scents of saline and the faint comforting trace of Lila's lavender hand lotion, the circle of women around her, Lila, Miriam, Elena, and even Harlan, who had relented to the room's unspoken gravity, formed a quiet perimeter, their presence no longer a barrier but a buffer against the world's sharper edges. The hum of the hospital beyond the door persisted, a symphony of distant pages and rolling carts. But here, in this suspended hush, the world narrowed to breaths sinking in uneven harmony, hands unclenching one by one. Lila broke the silence first, her voice a gentle thread weaving through the tension. "You've given us more than a child today. You've given us a chance to make it right. For her, for my niece, for all the ones we couldn't reach." She reached into the pocket of her scrubs, fingers emerging with a small embroidered pin shaped like a tiny stethoscope, its silver edges catching the light. It was a token from the staff's annual remembrance ceremony, awarded to those who embodied the quiet fights beyond the charts, the lost causes reclaimed, the overlooked souls pulled from the brink. Lila's hand trembled slightly as she pinned it to the collar of Ilara's jacket, the metal cool against the worn fabric, a weight both foreign and anchoring. "This isn't just a badge, it's a promise. You're part of us now." Ilara's fingers brushed the pin instinctively, the gesture sending a shiver through her, not from cold, but from the unfamiliar bloom of belonging. Tears welled anew, hot and unbidden, tracing paths down her cheeks as the moral ache in her chest eased, replaced by a warmth that seeped into her bones like sunlight after endless rain. She had carried guilt like a shadow for so long, the foster system's dismissals, the nights alone on the highway's edge, convinced her hands were too stained to hold anything fragile. But here, amid the beeps filtering from the hall and the soft rustle of scrubs, that shadow receded. Miriam nodded, her stern features softening further, and extended a hospital ID bracelet, its plastic band flexible and inscribed with a temporary access code. "Wear this. It gets you through the doors, up to see the baby, down to the cafeteria for a real meal. No more running alone." The bracelet clicked around Ilara's wrist, its presence a subtle hum of protection, linking her to the corridors that had once seemed impenetrable fortresses. Elena stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on Ilara's shoulder, the touch steady and reassuring, carrying the faint scent of antiseptic and the deeper undernote of empathy forged in endless shifts. "We see you, Ilara. Not as a case file or a street shadow, but as the girl who heard a cry when the world turned away, the mother upstairs. She's stabilizing. The baby too. And because of you, they'll have each other." The doctor's words carried the weight of late-night confessions in empty break rooms, where staff shed their professional shells to mourn the runaways who slipped through, the infants abandoned to fates too cruel to name. Harlan, observing from the doorway, closed her notepad with a soft snap, her expression shifting from duty to quiet alliance. "I'll handle the paperwork. Make sure social services knows the full story, the one that starts with courage, not suspicion." The room exhaled collectively, the tension uncoiling like a spring released, leaving space for the subtle micro-reactions. Lila's relieved smile, Miriam's subtle nod of approval, Eleanor's hand lingering a moment longer. As they guided Ilara toward the neonatal unit, the hospital unfolded around them in a tapestry of controlled life, the fluorescent light steady now, no longer harsh, but illuminating paths lined with staff who paused to offer nods or murmured thanks. Nurses in the hallway formed a loose honor guard, their eyes conveying the unspoken. You bridged what we couldn't, reminded us why we endure the fatigue and the losses. The air grew warmer as they ascended, carrying the soft, milky scent of the nursery, mingled with the reassuring beep of monitors tracking tiny heartbeats. Ilara's steps lightened, the bracelet on her wrist a talisman against the old fears, her hand finding Lila's in a grip that spoke of redemption found in unexpected hands. The overlooked girl, once a whisper on the wind, now walked among guardians whose toughness masked hearts as vulnerable as her own. In the neonatal room, the incubator glowed under warming lamps, the baby's tiny form nestled securely, chest rising in even rhythms that mirrored the quiet hope blooming in the space. The mother, wheeled in moments earlier, lay on a nearby bed, her color returning under IV drips, eyes fluttering open to meet Ilara's. No words passed at first, only a gaze heavy with gratitude, fingers intertwining in a silent vow. The staff lingered at the periphery, their hierarchy dissolving into a community woven from shared silences. The head nurse's approving glance, the doctor's steady charting, the nurse's tears drying into resolve. Ilara stood there, the pin glinting on her collar, feeling the threads of protection envelop her, meals promised, a cot in the staff lounge for rest, questions deferred until she was ready to answer. The world outside might still judge, but here, in this sanctuary of beeps and whispered cares, she had found a family not of blood, but of quiet heroism. The days blurred into a gentle rhythm, the hospital's nights less lonely, with the soft glow of monitors as companions. Ilara visited the baby daily, her sketches from the notebook now adorning the incubator's side, delicate drawings of sunlit meadows, promises of futures unmarred by highways and fog. The mother, recovering under Elena's care, shared fragments of her story. The isolation of single parenthood, the despair that had led to the unthinkable. In turn, Ilara spoke of her runs, the bruises hidden under layers of resolve, finding in their exchange a mirror to heal old wounds. Lila became a constant, slipping extra blankets and stories of her lost niece, turning grief into guidance. Miriam arranged for counseling, her tough exterior yielding to plans for Ilara's enrollment in a youth program tied to the hospital. A path to stability, not another system to flee. Yet the emotional undercurrents ran deep. The compassion behind the staff's efficiency revealing itself in small acts. A nurse braiding Ilara's hair during a quiet shift, Elena sharing coffee in the dawn hours, discussing dreams beyond survival. Society's misjudgments faded here. The cold professionals recast as warm sentinels, their tears upon the baby's return, a testament to hearts that beat fiercely for the vulnerable. Ilara's guilt softened, transformed by the belonging that wrapped around her like the warmed linens of the nursery. The pin and bracelet were more than symbols. They were keys to a community where redemption flowed through hallways lined with quiet applause, where the overlooked found voices in the beeps of new life. As the sun set on Ilara's first full week within these walls, she stood by the window overlooking the city, the highway a distant ribbon in the twilight. The air carried the faint chill of evening, but inside, warmth prevailed, the steady hum of the hospital a lullaby of second chances. She touched the pin again, its edges familiar now, a reminder that courage, once solitary, echoed in the hearts of those who chose to see. If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of Ilara reach more people who still believe in humanity. In the quiet aftermath, where fluorescent lights dimmed to night mode glow and the antiseptic hush enveloped the wards like a protective shroud, Ilara's journey wove into the fabric of St. Mary's, a thread of light amid the shadows of struggle. The newborn, named Hope by her grateful mother, thrived under the vigilant care, her cries evolving into coos that filled the nursery with promise. Ilara, no longer a fleeting shadow, became a fixture, assisting with simple tasks, her observant eyes catching what harried shifts might miss, her presence a bridge between the streets and these healing halls. The staff's acceptance deepened, their symbolic gifts evolving into invitations, shared meals in the cafeteria, where laughter pierced the fatigue, late-night talks in the lounge, unraveling the moral knots of lives led on the edge. Yet the somber poetry of it all lingered, the way the highway's fog mirrored the uncertainties still ahead, the faint scars on Ilara's wrist from old restraints, a reminder that redemption was a slow bloom, not a sudden dawn. The nurses, with their tears dried but memories etched, found in her a reflection of their own quiet battles. The compassion armored in scrubs, the heroism born from nights when giving up, would have been easier. Society might never fully grasp the humanity pulsing behind the beeps and protocols. But in this corner of the world, it endured, fragile and fierce. Subscribe for more stories of compassion, justice, and redemption. Thank you for watching the case of homeless girl found a missing newborn near the highway. Nurses arrived in tears. See you in the next one.